We'll turn to the next speaker. We're going to bring it home for those from Waterloo Region. So the next speaker is Jaime Stief. Jaime is a local communications professional and community advocate regarding homelessness. Her professional background includes nonprofit communications work for organizations that champion community engagement and the social determinants of health at the national and international levels. She's a member of the Unsheltered campaign and the region's prototyping project, and regularly collaborates with Fight Back KW. So Jaime, I want to thank you for being here. You have a lot of firsthand experience that I think everyone would really appreciate hearing about. So over to you.
And thank you so much for having me. And everything that I'm sharing, it's based on talking to and working with people with lived experience of homelessness, former shelter workers, current outreach workers, and other advocates who've been doing this work for a lot longer than I have. So I offer my thanks to them for sharing what they know with me. And what I guess part of what I wanted to share is going to be very elementary to some of the folks on the line, but maybe not all. Just what we're seeing, and this is from what I've observed at the encampments on Roos Island in Willow River Park, also known as Victoria Park, at the encampment at 100 Victoria, briefly at Soper Park in Cambridge, and also at places like A Better Tent City, 1001 Herbs. It's that you're meeting people who are not managing addiction, who aren't managing mental trauma. It's a lot of not all, but you meet a lot of seniors who are flagging that their pension no longer covers rent. You're meeting people who are on like long-term disability benefits where the stipend that they're on doesn't even cover living with roommates. A lot of people you meet are folks who had a completely stable life, and then there was one thing that happened that completely derailed them. Like people who were like, oh, I was making $100,000 a year, and then my brother died, and then it just was a downward spiral. And I share those to highlight the diversity of stories you hear in those encampments, and also to flag, but like, I also want to flag, however, that I guess, I don't know how a better way to say it, but just even the worst person even a person who has made poor life choices, also deserves housing and food. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with a bylaw officer when we did a protest last year where I was explaining, the people convicted of the worst crimes in society and go to jail still get shelter and food. And anyways, I'm flagging that as we're frequently, I say this as someone who talks to homeowners that live near encampments, and it's sort of like a kick me sign where you go and you're like, all right, come and yell at me about the encampment. Let's talk about it. And so many of it, there's so many perspectives of they deserve this. And it's hard to like reconcile that with the way that we treat, like you're condemning them to a worse fate than convicted criminals, if that makes sense. You mentioned that I'm working as part of the prototyping project with the Social Development Center. I'm using the funding to pay folks with lived experience of camping in the winter for a guide on winter survival. And I say this, having been on Roos Island in Victoria Park when a single woman living alone on Christmas Eve would rather camp in -15 conditions than go to a shelter because of the trauma because of how traumatic it is for her to go to the shelter. Just I'm flagging that as so many people are like, why are people turning down a perfectly adequate place to stay? And it's like the sense of what perfectly adequate means is quite relative. I want to reiterate what Margaret said, and this is what I'm hearing from folks, which is forcing people to move constantly, whether by having bylaw officers hassle them or enacting policies that ban them from workable spaces near services they use, is detrimental to their survival and their ability to remain stable as they recover from anything they might be recovering from. It seems obvious, but it's worth mentioning again. I'm thinking of the recent eviction of residents in Soper Park in Cambridge. I'm thinking of friends of mine who were much more involved, but what we saw with, like, we were moving people in the middle of the night in a very, like, you couldn't even put someone in an Uber to the new site because the Uber driver could leak the location of the new encampment, and that would bring bylaw back, and then they would all be forced to move again. And that would completely destabilize some people's ability to stay sober or clean. And so you're like, this feels like a refugee situation, but it's like, no, this is Cambridge. I think of countries that this is maybe an extreme example, but that ban abortion, and we always say you can't stop abortion, you can only stop safer abortions. That it'll still happen, just under much sketchier circumstances that can lead to long-term harm or death. And I have a similar stance on tent encampments, that you can ban people from parks and parking lots or any public spaces you like, but you are driving them into forests and ditches and abandoned buildings where the likelihood of a horror story goes up tenfold, and people's likelihood to recover from anything they're battling goes down even further. So I guess I'm saying own that when you enact and enforce those bylaws, that you are actively making it harder to do outreach, since it forces people to scatter and it becomes grossly inefficient to try and offer any sort of services or help on a recurring basis. And there's this, army of volunteers, of members of this community that are doing outreach work in addition to the, amazing paid outreach workers. But I'm just flagging that the unpaid labor that goes into supporting these communities is that much harder to do when bylaw cracks down and forces everyone to flee. I'm just naming that as a barrier. It's frustrating to sit and meet. I've been brought in to, for briefing regional staff. I recognize some familiar faces in the crowd here from those meetings. And we're having conversations about strategies to keep people warm in tents during a cold snap. And it's like, tents are not sustainable housing in any way. All it takes is a pissed off drug dealer or a group of delinquent teenagers to go through a tent encampment and start cutting holes in the tops of tents, which we've all seen, to start leaking the hot air out, and suddenly everyone's at risk of hypothermia. And so this thing where we're debating about ways to keep people warm in a tent, and I'm like, this is really we've been talking about Oktoberfest tents and emergency shelter tents, and my personal dream of co-opting some of the plethora of unused office space in downtown Kitchener post-pandemic. But it always comes down to, in my opinion, an unwillingness to consider some of those wraparound supports that have also been mentioned that are necessary to support these communities that maybe wouldn't be necessary for a member of the general public. Yeah. Similar to climate change, there won't be a single solution that fixes this. It's going to take 1,000 solutions that cater to the complexity of just life. I know that, and again, this is just my experience of talking to a lot of angry homeowners in downtown Kitchener who are upset about tent encampments. And I know that a lot of them can't empathize with people's experiences of addiction or serious mental health issues. I would say the most relatable aspect of encampment life that I could relate based on what I've heard is the feeling of being robbed. I've never heard of anyone being robbed as much as people living in tent encampments. And it's like, imagine the sense of distrust and disorientation and paranoia you would have if you got robbed every time you left your home for more than an hour or two. Like, it would completely impede your ability to do things that people shout at you, because people shout, like, get a job. And it's just such a disheartening situation. So my final thought would be, so back in the fall, Waterloo Region Community Legal Services, who were representing the encampment residents at the Valenti ruling, they hosted a poverty fall forum, and it had a whole bunch of different stakeholders relating to poverty and homelessness, social workers, NGO leads, Indigenous leaders, community organizers, all sharing insights on local poverty. And I'll always remember the director of a local NGO saying afterward, just casually, like, so there really aren't any new ideas, are there? And I think that's worth reiterating, that the tactics we're all using, they aren't new. Homelessness isn't new. Tent encampments aren't new, though they are growing. We know that. And the change we need is a paradigm shift in how we treat people who live in our communities who aren't profitable. Because right now it just seems like if you aren't profitable, it will never work in your favor. Anyways, those are my thoughts.
Jaime, I just want to say thank you very much for that very powerful presentation. You may not feel that way, but the words that you expressed and the stories that you shared were I think for a lot of people quite overwhelming and important to hear. So I don't really have anything to ask you. I just want to say thank you very much for what I know you weren't sure what you could contribute, but you contributed a tremendous amount. I just want to point out for others, I posted the Federal Housing Advocate recently came out with a report, and I thought of it now because Jaime's words very much spoke to what the Federal Housing Advocate had to say about upholding dignity and human rights, and talked about issues about enforced dismantling of encampments and those sorts of things. So I think it would be a good read for everyone to have a look through that